So, welcome to Module 16. We're now very firmly back in the modeling part of the course, and indeed of the book. And we're here to discuss a concept which will be of use to anyone building an interview, but also will crop up again later in a couple of other chapters. It's the idea behind something called an explanation. We all deserve explanations after all. In this chapter, we're going to look at what are the explanations, what does it actually mean. We're going to see when they can be used, how they can be customized, because by their nature, they're the kind of thing that you'll want to edit. And the final point is an interesting one, is it's often confused with other functionality. So we'll try and make it clear what an explanation is and what it is not. So, the good news is you already know what an explanation is. You've already seen it many times. It's the tree-like structure that shows the reasoning behind the outcome of an interview, behind a conclusion. It's clickable. Typically, you can drill down on it to find out what's going on. And it's customizable because in real life, there are probably certain things that you don't necessarily want to reveal as part of your explanation to an end user or a citizen. They either don't need to know, or the data is sensitive in some way, or it simply is irrelevant to the decision at hand. Here's a screenshot that should put you on the right track. You'll see here that I have an explanation at the end of an interview. I say it's at the end of an interview, but it could be anywhere in an interview, but it looks highly like the end of an interview. Bob is authorized to fly the plane, and you'll notice it says hide details just to the right there. That's because I clicked here a minute ago and it used to say show details. When I click it, I get maybe one or more of these little guys here to drill down into the detail of why Bob is authorized to fly the plane. So you have already seen an explanation, okay? And an explanation is added by default to the end of your interview on this interview complete page, and it typically demonstrates what is known as all the goals, the global goals. So the kind of default situation is when you reach the end of an interview, we'll tell you everything about why the outcome is what it is. But actually what's good to know is they can be placed on any screen in an interview, and you can put multiple explanations on a screen if that's what you need to do. Why would you want to do that? There are several different reasons why you'd want to do that. One, you're halfway or in the middle of a very long interview and you want to reveal to the user of the interview, well, this is where we are right now, this is what you helped me decide. It could be used for debugging purposes. You're running through the interview and you're confused as to why the outcome is what it is. There's no harm in dropping a few extra explanations into screens to give you that extra, oh, I see A plus B equals C, I get it. It can often help you in that respect. They can be added at any time, and we're going to go into the application in just a moment and see it. Before I go to my little demo, and we'll do a longer demo at the end of the chapter, I want to just highlight the fact that you have complete control over two main aspects of the explanation. Basically, anything that appears as part of the explanation is an attribute, something that you've calculated or something that you've created in a rule. So you can select explanation options, and you can decide how this attribute will behave when it's part of the explanation. We'll come on to that in just a second, but let's do a quick recap by going into the application. So I have a pre-built project, which is one you'll recognize from earlier on in this course. It's about assessing whether a pilot is apt to fly a plane. And within that structure of the different attributes, you'll notice that you have, for example, the candidate, their home base, their vision score, and so on. And you'll notice one here, which is the health criteria. The health criteria is an intermediate attribute. What it means is that the health criteria is actually driven by some other attributes in a chain underneath. So you'll see here in my screenshot that the health criteria is actually driven by the vision score. If your vision score is greater than or equal to 20, we consider that you satisfy the health criteria. Okay, so we're going to use the health criteria and the vision score as the basis for this little demo. What I've done is on the interview, I have gone to new control explanation, and I have added the health criteria as a separate explanation. So you're allowed to add as many explanations as you need to your interview. So when I run my debug, and Steve is authorized to fly the plane, and Steve satisfies the health criteria because he has a vision score of 21. So I've gone ahead and entered some sample data. But let's imagine that for the purposes of sharing this information with the end user, I actually don't need to display the vision score. I want the vision score to not show up in the explanation. I don't want the reasoning to change. I don't want the logic to change. I've just decided that I don't want to see the vision score. What we call this is, I want the vision score to be silent. I want it to disappear from this clickable area. So I'm going to go into my data, I'm going to go to the vision score, and I'm going to go to the explanation options. I'm going to say, always make this attribute invisible. So the vision score will cease to display. If I click OK, and I click debug, now the clickable zone is still there, but there's nothing to show or hide. So the health criteria, it still works, the logic is still respected, but that sensitive information or whatever it is about his vision score is no longer displayed. So when we talk about an attribute that's had its explanation options changed to say that it is invisible, it's disappeared from the explanation. And you'll notice that I can choose it to be always or in certain circumstances. That can be very useful, is that when the answer is no, maybe you want to display more information than when the answer is a positive. So you can decide, well, okay, if this is certain or unknown or always. And you'll notice underneath as well, we have the concept of silent. When you have an intermediate attribute, so I'm going to go ahead and clear all of these off. So we're back to where we started. And I'm going to go to an intermediate attribute like the health score, and I'm going to go to explanation options. I could also just use hide proving attributes, which means hide everything underneath it in a chain. In this case, it would have the same result because the vision score was the only thing in the chain. But what I will say in this case is, I will hide the proving attributes if the candidate satisfies the health criteria. So if they meet the health criteria, don't bother telling them about the vision score. But if they don't meet the health criteria, I do want to show them that data. So silent becomes very useful when you want to say things like, well, don't bother showing them. If it's successful, they don't care. But if they are not successful, maybe it's interesting for them to know why they weren't. So I'll go ahead and click true, click OK, and click OK. And I'll have to adjust the data for Steve to make sure that he doesn't meet the criteria. Because at the moment, he meets the criteria, so there's nothing to show. I'm going to go back and say that Steve has a vision score of 16. You'll notice that now I will show you the chain of attributes underneath the score, the health criteria, because we thought it would be useful to you to see it when the condition is false. So when you don't meet the criteria, you do see it. But if I made a mistake, actually, yes, it's not 16, it's 26. We'll see that it's no longer useful, so we've decided to render it invisible for the purposes of this explanation. So you can customize how your explanation is displayed, and you can have as many explanations as you wish. Of course, I put both of these on the final screen because I only have 2 screens, but you can have as many as you want in different places. And as a final point of this little demo is, if you have created one, remember that you can still use features that we saw in earlier chapters like show if. So maybe this doesn't even show up unless you have a certain condition that is met. So the whole clickable area will only display in certain circumstances, when it's a pilot from Canada or when the aeroplane is on the ground. Up to you to imagine what logic is in there. But you can use all of your standard show if, hide if features with your explanations as well. So let's go back to the slides and finish off with our overview of explanations. So you saw me in there working with the explanation options dialog, which basically meant we had invisible, which is hide an attribute, and silent, which is hide the proving attributes, hide the chain underneath. And this is per attribute, which gives you a very fine-grained approach as to what shows up in the explanation. So the end user experience will change based on whether you've said to hide something, make it silent, or make it invisible. So if you're not Canadian, we decide that there's no point in showing you the stuff about your Canadian passport, so we simply don't show it in the explanation. It's very useful to be able to use the silent when true or false, so that when a condition is met, we don't or we do, so that we don't clutter up the screen when it's not necessary, but when it is useful, we display the data. So we can use that, as I showed you in my example, to reveal more only when necessary. In this case, in this screenshot, the candidate is not Canadian, so we do show the information and the clickable arrow provides the extra data. So that's a case of it's shown when it is a false value, but hidden when it's a true value. Another piece of customization that might interest you, and you'll see this in the demo at the end of the chapter, is there's a feature in Oracle Policy Modeling called reference tags, which you may have heard of before, which is the idea of referencing legislation or source material in your Word document. And this can be very useful when debugging, because then you can remind yourself, okay, they met criteria X, which is from legal document Y. I'm going to step very briefly back into Word to show you how to enter a reference tag and what that looks like in the explanation. So in this Word document, I'm going to add what are known as reference tags. I should state for the record that they're not uniquely linked to the concept of explanations, but I think they bring an added value to the explanation. I'm going to focus on the health criteria and the vision score, which are the two elements that we looked at before. And I'm going to say, well, actually, this health criteria has a tag associated with it. So I just clicked on Add Tag, and it's related to law number 1. And I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to add another tag. And this is going to be Law 1, Article 1, for example. Whatever I write is up to me, but between those two square brackets, this is a reference tag. It's for my reference. I'm going to make sure I validate the work. No error is found. Close the Word document. And we're going to notice a couple of things. First of all, it means that when I'm in the explanation, I can see the reference tags. This is a feature that can be switched off. In the Interview tab, there's an option to switch off reference tags, but it makes it really very useful if the person who is running this interview is in any way familiar with the law and the articles. This is great for debugging because they can say to you, well, yeah, that's weird, Richard, your scenario didn't seem to fit with my knowledge of the law, my knowledge of the articles. It has another reason for being effective, is that when you use the hidden or the invisible or silent and you see that articles are disappearing, you'll know that they are not being taken into account. The final and perhaps one of the most useful features of this is you can use the search feature to search for your reference tags. So if you're busy knowing, if someone's told you you have to update the rules in respect of Law 1, Article 1, you know that you can type in Law number 1 up here in the search feature and go find that and make changes to it very quickly. So reference tags add a little extra, and you can switch them on and off globally here for your project in the Interview tab by choosing hide or show. But to my mind, they add a useful added benefit when you're debugging, because you can begin to understand, okay, this was because of Law 1. Okay, this is Law 1 in here, and so I need to go and edit this rule because I got something wrong. You can take it to the next level if you really want. And you could, for example, combine everything we've seen so far. So making things invisible, making things silent to cut out irrelevant children, irrelevant branches. But you could also combine that with reference tags to add extra information to the end user. And you could go one step further and use a feature we saw in previous chapters to use substitutions to make the data easier to read. I want you to take a look at what's on the left-hand side of this screen, because they're actually the same thing. So here is, whoops, Sorry, let me get myself sorted out. This is a standard explanation that has been provided as by default by OPM in my interview. And it's an interview for managing expenses. And it says the total cost of all expenses of type airfare is 200. And then it goes on a whole series of child attributes saying this was a flight, it's an airfare, car isn't an airfare, hotel isn't an airfare. Basically, if you look very carefully, what you're really interested in is the total cost of airfares. You're interested in that one and that one. Everything else is essentially, for the most part, I would say, irrelevant. It's background noise. By working hard to produce and use invisible attributes, invisible explanation options, silent explanation optionally by adding reference tags, and using substitutions, this is what we end up with. Far more clear, far more logical, and removes all the background noise. So in this case, it could be that I've gone back into my rule and I've selected areas and I've added reference tags, with the result that I now have reference tags in my explanation. And for those of you who are interested, if you're working with your Oracle Policy Modeling project outside of interviews, meaning you're using them as web services, then you have options when working with web services to describe whether you want what's known as a decision report. A decision report is essentially the same thing as an explanation, only used as a web service, so used as pure text, no HTML, no screen display, but the details of the reasoning would still be available to. So it's still available to you when you're working in web services. Now we come on to the last couple of slides, which is people often confuse explanations with something, and they often confuse it with this. They're in the debugger, and they're looking at the decision tab, and they say to me, well, Richard, yeah, this is just the same thing, right? It's just a big tree of logic. True, it has a lot in common with the explanation, but the decision tab that you see here, you can't hide things. You can't decide that something is not worth showing. This is for debugging purposes. This is for truly drilling down into the why. So it would make little sense if things would suddenly disappear from here, because it would make debugging a lot harder. There's another feature it's often mistaken for, is the audit report. It's kind of the same deal, is that an audit report, you don't get to mess with an audit report. You can't hide things from an audit report. So optionally, you can tell OPM to create audit reports for attributes. You don't get to say whether things are silent or things are invisible, because that would undermine the purpose of an audit report. An audit shows all of the changes to a value. So what do I want you to remember? I want you to remember that an explanation is something that, in my opinion, is underused in a standard interview. You get one and it's right at the end. You can use explanations to explain to yourself or explain to the end user anything that is worth explaining. Any intermediate or any sub-attribute that you want to explain to yourself, well, why did I get that value? Secondly, it can be that the explanation is very useful, but you want to hide background noise. You want to make things invisible or silent. You can do that to make the user experience more fluid and just get rid of things that aren't relevant. Finally, as we'll see in the next chapter, explanations are often used when we have to provide more tangible feedback to the end user. Demo coming up, but for now, that's it.